Hello, I'm Seun Matiluko, and this is another installment of our OLBA Changemakers video series. I'm delighted to be joined here today with Afua Hirsch. Thank you so much for joining me today, Afua.
You're welcome. It's nice to meet you, Seun.
It's nice to meet you. And I think my first question to you is, did I pronounce your name correctly? And how do you pronounce your name? Because I was reading your book, British, the other day, and it really spoke to me because in the first chapter, you talk about how many of us who have quote unquote difficult names or foreign names anglicize our names or change our names within British society. So how do you pronounce your name?
Thank you for asking. And it's actually a more complicated question, as I'm sure you know, than it sounds, because my name has a vowel that doesn't exist in English. It's a Chi name. My mum's from Ghana. She's from the Akan ethnic group. And my actual name is Afua, but even I don't pronounce it perfectly because I don't speak Chi. I have been learning for a long time. And I think you're completely spot on when you talk about the way we anglicize our own names, because it's not just people mispronouncing my name, which of course they do, even the version that I give them. But it's also that you, from a young age, I think, get used to the idea that your name is somehow difficult and burdensome to expect people to pronounce, and you internalize the reaction you anticipate, which is that they'll get it wrong or find it difficult. And so you offer them an anglicized version. And it's actually been interesting because when I wrote about that in my book and confessed really that I don't pronounce my own name properly, which felt actually like a really personal and difficult thing to write about, I was completely astonished at the reaction and how many people from so many different cultural and ethnic backgrounds related to that. Just to give you one example, I did an event with the Mayor of London, and he confessed to me live on stage at this event that his name is not Sadiq Khan, it's Sadiq, and that he had also from childhood been mispronouncing his own name because that was what people called him. You know, kids at school calling him Sid, and it just became Sadiq. And the idea to me that, you know, such an important elected official, probably the most powerful elected executive in Western Europe, who's not white, is mispronouncing his name, and we are all complicit in that. It was just a really good example to me of how widespread a phenomenon that is. And it's not something that we really talk about. You just get on with it, you know, on the scheme of things and the battles that you pick to fight. It's probably not the one at the top, but a name is important. It speaks to your identity, your sense of self, and the way you take up space in the world. And I suppose for me to have been mispronouncing my own name, I realized was almost like an apology for my existence. And so if you want to be unapologetic and reclaim that pride in your heritage and take up space, I think it is important to be able to speak about it and actually insist on it being said properly.
I relate to that so heavily, like every single thing you said I relate to, because even my name, so my name is spelled Seun, but my name is a Yoruba name, and in the Yoruba alphabet there's an S with a dot underneath, which is a sh sound, which is why my name is Seun. But growing up, people were calling me Sean. I even anglicized my name to make it Shoan or Shayan, when realistically it's Seun. And yeah, for a long time, I really hated my name. I felt like I wanted to be called something else. I wanted my parents to give me an English name. Why do I have this name that white people can't say? But I got to university and I met a load of other Black people, including one Nigerian who made a comment that really cuts me to this day. He said, "You don't even know how to pronounce your name. Don't talk to me." I was like, no, I know how to pronounce my name. I just make it easier for white people. But I came to the conclusion that, you know what, my name is Oluwaseun, and it means we give thanks to God. And I think that's quite a beautiful name. So I'm going to...
It is beautiful, and it has such an important meaning. And so when you massacre it, you're diminishing its meaning. But I think, you know, it's so typical that when you met other Nigerian or Yoruba students, you started to have a different approach. And for me, it was going to Ghana for the first time and realizing that the idea of pronouncing my name wrongly was ludicrous in a country where my name actually means girl born on Friday. So it's incredibly common in Ghana. So nobody in Ghana obviously struggles with my name. And when I realized there's a whole society of people who fluently use this name, are familiar with it and know its meaning, it really bolstered my confidence to own it, I think. And I think that's why it really goes to the root of being a minority, or that emotional experience of being minoritized. And in a way, you have to be part of a majority, or you have to experience the critical mass of other people who share your culture and history to be able to get the confidence to own these markers of your identity. And that is, I think, why it's really important as a Black person to spend time on the African continent, for example, because unless you've had that experience, you will never really have a deep understanding of what context you're part of and why it matters.
That's interesting because so there are many things that you said that I think are good jumping off points, but I think so there's a moment in your book, and I hope it's okay that I'm bringing it up, where you talk about being assaulted and people not helping you. I think in Senegal, and people saying that they might protect you if you gave them money. And I think so. I've been to Nigeria myself a couple times, and I felt after I returned from Nigeria, I felt even more confused about my identity in a way, in that I felt like in Nigeria, people were calling me Oyibo, people were calling me a white person. And in the UK, oftentimes I feel like I don't really belong here too. So it's sort of like you're stuck in a diaspora land. I don't know if you've ever felt that way as well.
Completely. And I think that's actually what drove me to write my book at its root, because when I was at Oxford, had a professor, first time I'd ever been taught by a Black teacher, first time I'd ever been taught by a Black man. He was actually Nigerian. Sadly, he passed away a few years ago, Ralph Mustafa, but he was a legendary professor at Oxford, and he was teaching me decolonization and the history of African political movements. And it totally radicalized me. The experience of being taught by this Afrocentric, incredibly erudite and authoritative scholar on African independence movements. And I decided that I could solve my problem very simply by moving back to the African continent, by living there, by taking up my place in the world as a proud African. And it kind of seems naive to narrate it in hindsight, but obviously I got to the African continent and only then realized that, one, how British I was, two, the level of color privilege that I was enjoying, how I was perceived as having all this proximity to whiteness. And three, I suppose, just how far I was from the experience of people who had grown up in African countries and never lived in the UK or the US or any of the other Western countries that form the diaspora. And on top of that, I was living in Senegal, which isn't the country of my heritage, and which also has a specific history of exploitation, primarily by France, of international NGO, business, military people exploiting the economy in a really particular way. And of course, I was associated with that in the perception of local people, and why wouldn't I be? And I think that said something in a way to the Eurocentric gaze that I didn't even know that I had, that I thought I could just go to an African country and just blend in and have a nice life. And I think it's really uncomfortable to unpick that, especially when you have grown up in Britain being racialized as Black. You feel, in a way, the least you deserve is to be able to go to a Black country and enjoy your Blackness. And so then to go to a Black country and be racialized as white or associated with European exploitation is really painful. But it's also really important because it's not about you, and it's about a pattern of history that continues. And I think if you're really serious about being pro-Black, about being anti-racist, and about being Pan-African, then you have to engage with that history. You have to understand it, you have to see its current manifestation, and you have to locate yourself in it. You can't exempt yourself from scrutiny or understanding your role as part of the problem as well as part of the solution. And that's all difficult, but I think it's totally crucial. So I can relate to that experience. And in Ghana, they call me Obrini, which means white person. And the number of arguments I've had with people in Ghana where I've tried to persuade them not to call me Obrini, and it's futile, because as far as Ghanaians are legitimately concerned, I am like a British person to them. And you know, what can I say? And that's why I called my book Brit-ish.
Even talking about locating yourself within like geopolitics, world politics, I really relate to that as well, because I think the first time I remember going to Nigeria was when I was 8, and people heard me speaking and they started begging like for me to give them money, and I was very confused because I thought, I'm a child, so how I don't have any money. But then I realized that because there's a perception of the West is so much richer than many of the people in Nigeria, it makes sense. And I started thinking more about how do we as British people, or how does Britain relate to Africa, and things like that. But I wanted to ask you actually, because you said something in passing in which you said that you're currently learning Tree. And I think that's interesting because I didn't grow up speaking Yoruba. And I think many of my Ghanaian Ghanaian friends, they didn't grow up speaking any of their languages as well. And I wonder, why do you think that is? Because there are certain people from other minority groups, I think certain people in the South Asian diaspora in particular are keen for their children to learn the languages of their ancestors, but it seems that many Africans who come here try to assimilate heavily and don't teach their children the language. I wonder what your thoughts were on that.
I do think that that is a direct consequence of the pattern and history of colonialism in Africa. And I think when you look at the experiences of our parents and grandparents, the ways they were educated and conditioned into Eurocentric ideas, into Christianity, in some cases literally punished for speaking their own language at school, missionary schools that promoted the idea that Blackness was specifically linked to savagery, barbarianism, paganism, all these things that were associated with backwardness, and that progress was assimilating as much as possible into whiteness. And there's so much you can say about that white supremacist ideology that underpinned empire, because it's ludicrous on many levels, one of which is you're racializing people as Black in this formulation of race that Europeans invented, whilst also telling them that the best thing that can happen to them is that they can emulate European ideology that regards their Blackness as inferior. You know, the whole thing is ludicrous, but it was also very effective. And, you know, in my family, many of my parents, grandparents, great-grandparents went to schools where they were taught and brainwashed into believing that the best thing that could happen to their descendants was that they could become as much like white people as possible. That they could become Christian, that they could speak English with the most British accent possible, that they could marry white people and have children who would become physically closer to whiteness. These are all really real legacies of colonialism in West Africa. So not all of those things apply to every family, but I think on the whole, you do see a pattern where many of our parents thought that the best thing that could happen to us was that we speak English properly, and that they were so concerned with that they feared teaching us our own languages would somehow interfere with our ability to speak English with an English accent. And that's really sad, because so many other cultures understand multilingualism, and that you can actually, even if you accept the premise that it's good to speak English with an English accent, you can still learn your other language and still speak English fluently. But you know, I think that really goes to the root of how deep this colonial conditioning was. And you know, take a country like Ghana. I mean, Nigeria is a bit different, but Ghana was told it was the model colony in Africa, and Ghanaians were actually proud of that. You know, those Ghanaians who were co-opted into the colonial system and went above and beyond to assimilate and to prove their allegiance to Britain and their affinity for British culture and the English language. And I think it's one of those dichotomies that Ghana always also produced Kwame Nkrumah and a generation of people who were trying to fight this colonial ideology, but one thing spurned the other. So it's a really proud history of resistance, but it's also a history of assimilation into empire and internalizing the values of white supremacist colonization. And I think we live with the consequences of that today. And that's one reason that I find it really difficult when people say that this is history, that this is something that is now irrelevant, or that it should be confined to being spoken about in 1 month of the year. You know, for those of us who have grown up with the ongoing consequences of this colonization and this destruction of our cultural heritage, it's part of who we are. It's part of the way we speak, the food we eat, the way we relate to our family, the way we inhabit space. It just couldn't be more existential. And I think we're still unpicking what those centuries of colonization have done.
Yes, I completely agree. Like, I'm not for nothing, I'm in my early 20s and my dad was born a British subject. So it's really not that long ago. But, and even you can see, I think in countries like Uganda, the stranglehold that evangelical Christianity seems to have in influencing local politics. But based on what you said though, I wanted to ask you, because I did another interview for this series recently, and the interviewee expressed that the history of colonialism is more complex than us privileged people in Britain recognize, and that some people on the African continent thought that colonialism was a good thing, thought that, as you say, that Ghana was a model colony, and that we shouldn't be trying to say that that's the sort of influence of white supremacy, or that's the influence of sort of a colonial thought process, because that's actually us being patronizing to Africans. And I wonder if you would have a response to that.
I think that that is a mindset that reflects the ongoing conditioning of empire, really. And, you know, this isn't personal. I take my grandfather. My grandfather was the son of a cocoa farmer from a rural village in what was then the Gold Coast. He won a scholarship to Cambridge in the 1940s, very early 1940s, which was incredibly rare. I think there were four students every year from the Gold Coast were given scholarships to go to England. And this was presented as an act of benevolence, but actually it was crucial to Britain's model of running the empire, because Britain used indirect rule in its West African colonies. They couldn't send large numbers of British people to run the administration, so they trained Africans. The idea being that if they sent these young men, including my grandfather, to Oxbridge, they would be so indoctrinated and seduced by English civilization that they would go back and perpetrate the system on their people themselves. And that worked. It was highly effective. And in my grandfather's case, of course, it was an incredible opportunity. He was part of an imperial system. That was the reality he was born into. And he was being given an opportunity to progress within that system. And he took it, and it changed his life, and it changed the fortune of his family and his descendants. And I wouldn't be here if he hadn't had that opportunity. So yes, imperialism offered opportunities to many Africans, and many Africans had huge amounts of agency within that and were able to use it to better their future. But at the same time, that doesn't negate the reality that that is based on the entire continent being co-opted into a globalized capitalist system that was designed to extract and exploit for the benefit of Europe. That was the basis of the imperial system they found themselves in. They couldn't change that system on their own, so they strived to do the best they could within it. And I think that you can analyze the individual stories, and you can also analyze the systemic level, the structure of empire, and the ideology on which it was based. And that ideology was that the best thing that could happen to a young man like my grandfather was for him to get away from his culture, for him to abandon his religion, for him to speak somebody else's language, and for him to promote those values throughout the generations to come. And so when I hear people saying, you know, the empire was actually good, I see the success of that project. That's exactly what it was designed to do. It was designed to make us feel grateful to be in Britain. And you see that in quite sophisticated, nuanced ways. You see it in crude ways when people say to us, you should be really grateful to be here. Basically, we rescued you from the heart of darkness and brought you into the light of European civilization. Why aren't you thanking us? And anybody who can't see what's wrong with that, I don't know if I can reach them.
Not to keep relating things back to my family, but it's just interesting because a lot of you say I relate to, and I guess that speaks to how British colonialism worked. But my grandfather, for example, was given money to create a church, and that's how my family became Christian. Switching gears slightly to talk about Britain, though, I wonder, what was your experience growing up as a Black person or a mixed race person in Britain, and how do you see the current generation of Black British people dealing with British society? And I ask this because, so David Goodhart wrote a review of your book, which I think that you've seen before, and which, in my opinion, was slightly bigoted review of your book, because he seemed to suggest that there were like good Black people who are free thinkers and that you weren't a free thinker. But he wrote a review of your book in which you say which he says that you're part of the school of thought that, you know, racism is bad, society is to blame, we're still stuck in the past. Whereas people would suggest that racism and racial equality the fight for racial equality has gotten better in Britain. Today's generation don't have to deal with the National Front or people saying no Blacks, no dogs, no Irish. So I guess I say all that to say is, what was your experience growing up as a Black person, and do you see things changing over the past couple of decades? And do you think that the next generation of Black British people, that they have different issues to face or very similar issues to face?
I don't want to lower the tone of our conversation by going into too much detail about David Goodhart's theory, but it's essentially this: we colonized most of the African continent, we co-opted African nations into an extractive economy that works for us. We let them fight and die for us in the war. We required them to come to Britain to do low-wage jobs to build the country. And then they have, oh, and then we subject them to violent gangs that murder them for being Black and virulent racism. And then when that racism becomes less violent, we expect them to be extremely grateful for that we still permit them to remain in the country whilst not being faced with daily threats to their lives. And if they're not grateful, they're bad immigrants and then they should go back to where they came from. You really couldn't make it up. And I just find it remarkable that that narrative keeps repeating itself in new generations of right-wing, sometimes thinly veiled racist commentary, sometimes less veiled. I think his response to my book essentially was that I'm the bad immigrant, I should be grateful. And this narrative about progress, I think, is complicated because it's the fact that there has been some change. You know, the racism that I've battled, to answer your main question, in my life has not been of a confrontational, violent nature. It's been insidious, it's been implied, it's been, in my interpersonal experiences of racism, it's been more microaggressive. In the system that I inhabit in this country, I think that much of what our previous generations who did face violent racism has not changed. When you look at the outcomes for Black people, when you look at how Black people are represented in housing poverty and income inequality, in poor educational outcomes, and obviously within that there's huge divergence and diversity within different Black communities. You know, Nigerian British people have some of the best performing outcomes in education in some socioeconomic groups. Black Caribbean children have some of the worst. So the way we even talk about the Black experience obviously conflates very divergent experiences and identities. But I think it's actually good to think about the David Goodharts of the world, because what hasn't changed is the colonial narrative and the colonial gaze. That hasn't changed at all. There's never been a moment where Britain has acknowledged what it did on the African continent, in the Atlantic world, where it broke with the white supremacist underpinnings of that entire system. We are inhabiting the continuation of that history. It's changed form. Instead of the empire, we talk about the Commonwealth. Instead of violently hounding Black people out of Britain, we tolerate them. And the language of tolerance, I think, is probably the best example of how this works. Black people are allowed to be in Britain and they are tolerated, and tolerance is promoted as if it's some kind of virtue. And the idea that you would use a word like tolerance to describe your attitude towards people who are British, to me, is remarkable. It's saying that it's a problem because they're not white, but we tolerate them. And that's not my word. That is really the kind of official word that British society and government and the media uses to talk about relations between what they perceive to be Indigenous white Britain and Black and Asian, what they perceive to be immigrants. And so the whole construct of the conversation really shows how far we haven't come. And I don't think you really need to go much further than to look at the language, or to look at the data, or to look at the framing of the debate to really reveal that when it comes to the underpinning ideological mainframe of the system, it hasn't changed. It hasn't changed because no one's tried to change it.
So I agree very much with what you're saying. And like, as I said, I found David Goodhart's review quite bigoted in my opinion, because it seems sort of like Candace Owens type rhetoric, where Candace Owens says that Black people who are Democrats or liberals are slaves on a plantation, and it's only Black conservatives who are free thinkers and who are going to pave the way. But a response to what you're saying might be that there are some Black people in this country who don't feel that way. There are some Black people on the political right who are very outspoken, who feel that we are the most tolerant country in Europe, and that it is a privilege to be British, that we should be thankful that we're not Black people in Russia or Spain, that in the UK is the best place to be a Black person. And I wonder, I don't necessarily agree with those arguments, but I wonder how you'd respond to those arguments.
I think that no system of mental colonization can succeed without the complicity of the people it colonizes. That was the case during empire. You know, without the complicity of Africans, Britain couldn't have colonized the African continent. Without the complicity of Black people who are benefiting from the current system, this system can't thrive. And I think it's incredibly useful that there are individual Black people who are doing extremely well. When you look at the cost that seems to be extracted from Black people who are doing well in the current system. When I say doing well, I don't mean thriving, because I think many of us are thriving in spite of the underlying racist foundations of the system we live in. But there are Black people who seem to be enthusiastically involved in denying that there is a problem, in criticizing Black people who do identify the problem, and in essentially saying what white people want to hear. And I can see why that works, because it's much easier not to have to think about how much unfairness we still live with. It's nice to hear that everything is fine. It's great to find somebody that's worse off than you so you can compare yourself and find yourself performing favorably. It's great to say in Russia they kill Black people, so we're good. If Russia is the bar, then everything else that Britain says about itself doesn't make sense. And I do think that it is interesting how Britain likes to do that. You know, well, our empire wasn't so bad because Portugal's was worse. Our slavery wasn't that bad because in the American South it was more brutal, which doesn't necessarily stand up to factual scrutiny. But there's always an argument that someone else was worse. And, you know, for me, I actually would kind of go back to my own sense of Britishness, because I am British. I was raised in Britain. And I think actually it's a phenomenon of many descendants of empire that we are the ones that actually drunk the Kool-Aid about empire. You know, some of the most patriotic, pro-royalist, for example, people I know are people who were born in West African countries that when they were still colonies. And the British values that I was raised with are not we're slightly better than Russia, or our brutality was slightly less brutal than Portugal's. It was, we are an enlightened nation. We have democratic values. We promote equality. We think everybody should have opportunity. We believe in meritocracy. So when you apply those values to the current and past predicament of Black people in the British system, there's really very little you can say to defend it. And I think we should judge Britain by its own values, not by this new faux low bar that people seem to find, specifically when they want to talk about the Black experience.
And talking about the Black experience in Britain or racial inequality in Britain, because you work in the media space, do you think that we do enough to talk about racial inequality in Britain in the press or in broadcast journalism? And I ask this because you mentioned the royal family, and it does appear to some people that when we talk about Black people in Britain, we talk about the Spectator attacking Marcus Rashford, or the Daily Mail attacking Meghan Markle, but we don't seem to talk a lot about racial inequality that persists amongst the Black working class, for example. So do you think that the press or the media does enough?
I think that's a really good example of how the debate has been framed in a way that's designed not to actually increase understanding and awareness. So this false dichotomy between the white working class and Black people, when the majority of Black people in Britain are working class. So it's been very deliberately, I think, framed in a way that pits groups that, as we know, and historically it's always been the case, should be able to find solidarity because they are not benefiting from the overall class capitalist system. It pits them against each other. And it's always been convenient. It's always been a convenient way to distract attention from the fact that this is a society that has failed to distribute the benefits of its undeniable material progress at all equally. You know, we have some of the most shocking rates of inequality of any developed nation. And instead of communities that should be radicalized by that, really engaging with it, they have been given a convenient visible other to scapegoat. That visible other has been Eastern Europeans, it's been Black people, it's been Asian people, it's been whatever visible minority is a more convenient target than the real system, which is one that benefits those who promote these narratives. You look at our media, patterns of media ownership, you can see why the media is not in a rush to really open apart and create a substantive conversation about why this country has failed to achieve real equality or progress towards the redistribution of wealth. And I've been part of that myself. I've been in so many media debates where instead of a conversation about inequality, it's framed as a debate where you have somebody who denies inequality or racism exists versus somebody like me who is trying to further an understanding of how it works and how we can solve it. So the conversation is not designed to deepen knowledge or awareness or create solutions. It's designed as a form of entertainment to try and deny that the problem exists in the first place. And that is really, really universal, especially among the broadcast media. And it's something that I personally have been pushing back against. And I won't do those debates anymore because I can see over time that they're not designed to actually get to the root of the problem. And I think until the pattern of media ownership changes, it's really difficult to see how you can challenge that. But at the same time, I do think your generation are so much more literate and so much better at organizing around those problems. And it's not a solution because social media, as we know, is repeating many of the inequalities of the traditional media. And actually, you know, when we look at the future, in some ways it's worse, and we don't even know the full extent of how technology will increasingly create bias against minority groups. But at the same time, I think that I'm 40, I turned 40 this year. You know, it took me almost 40 years to realize that the media had no intention of creating the conditions in which the problems could be solved. So I think that awareness is coming earlier and earlier for subsequent generations, and that's got to be a positive thing.
But with that though, and this might be an uncomfortable question, but many people say that, for example, people like you, Black people in the media, they often tend to be middle-class Black people, or Black people who went to Oxbridge, or Black people who went to private school. And as you say, the majority of Black people in this country are working class. And so even with increased awareness amongst my generation or increased voices within the media space of Black people, is it not the case that it's continuing the cycle of privileged people speaking about issues that are not necessarily, that's not necessarily their lived experience?
It's completely the case. And that's why talking about the extent to which we live in a class society and that this whole system is rigged is so important. And I think you're completely right. And there's only so much it can be useful for a privileged, private school educated Oxbridge graduate who is mixed race to be the person that is pushing back against these systems of unfairness. And I think you've got to recognize in yourself the extent to which you're part of the problem. Otherwise, you're just as bad as everything that you're criticizing. So I think that's completely true. And I try and use my platform to draw attention to it at every opportunity. But I also think it's important for someone like me to take a back step and work out how I can be part of democratizing the spaces. And that's not to say that it's something that I give to other people, but I think you've got to put as much energy into trying to change the bias in the spaces that you work in as you have put into being in them yourself. So that's something that I absolutely believe in, and it's undeniable. You look at the people who are given a platform to talk about the Black experience, how many of us are mixed race. You look at the people who are given a platform to talk about inequality, how many of us are Oxbridge educated or come from middle class backgrounds. The facts speak for themselves. It's not a conspiracy theory. It's extreme. And I think that again goes to just how little has changed in this country. You know, and you can see that now that there is this economic and branding need for companies and media organizations to promote diversity, they will always choose the most acceptable face of Blackness, the one they find least threatening and most proximate to what they're used to. And I think you've just got to keep calling that out because it's extreme.
Just to say, I think our time is slowly running out, but is it all right if I ask you 2 more questions?
Yeah.
So based on what you said, so I was a massive fan of yours on The Pledge. I enjoyed watching you on The Pledge, and I like those sort of shows because I like talk to the TV and feel like I'm part of the conversation. But it's based on what you're saying, do you think that you'll ever appear on a show like The Pledge again? And I ask that because it seems to me, and maybe they would disagree with this characterization of themselves, but it seems to me that people like Nick Ferrari and Carol Malone are not really interested in what you have to say, in the same way that when Black people go on Good Morning Britain, when Piers Morgan was on the show, it didn't really appear that Piers Morgan was really interested in what they had to say. He was just there to shout over them. And so I ask this mainly because I've seen on social media that some Black people are skeptical of Black figures appearing on these quote unquote debate shows, where, as you say, one person is arguing against inequality and one person appears to be arguing for inequality, if not in express terms, there doesn't really seem to be any pushing of the needle forward. In fact, some people suggest that Black people appear on these shows more to raise their profile and get social media followers more than actually trying to influence people's minds. And I wonder what you would say to any of that.
I think I've really addressed that. I mean, I can't speak to the motives of other Black people or ethnic minority people who appear on those shows, whether it's to increase their followers or whether because they genuinely believe that they could be part of a conversation that could be positive. In my case, it was the latter. At least that's what I genuinely believe, that my motive for going on those shows is that I think now in hindsight, naively, I thought that I could be part of a conversation that would wake people up, that would educate people, that would promote what I knew to be the case, other people who share my views, that I could be a voice for that perspective. And over time, I realized that that's not what it's designed to do. It's designed to be a form of entertainment. It's designed to delegitimize and trivialize these perspectives by presenting them in some kind of false equivalence, as if you've got racism and anti-racism and they can argue each other out. I totally reject that. I categorically reject that. I think it's wrong in principle. I think it furthers the problem rather than the solution. And that's why I personally don't take part in those shows anymore. I never tell other people what to do. And I think that there are still Black people who appear on those programs with good intentions to educate people and promote a perspective that we need to hear. But I'm very critical of the media organizations that pit those voices against racist, bigoted and ignorant voices as if they create some kind of balance together. I think that's wrong. And I think it's good that people are identifying that and criticizing it, because I think it needs a critique. So everybody has to work out how they engage with this problem. It's not just the media. I think it's a symptom of the views that are still mainstream in our society. But I personally don't do those shows anymore for that exact reason.
And so how do you see yourself moving forward in the media industry? So you practiced law for some time and even taught on the GDL at BPP. And now you're a well-established figure in the media industry. You're even the Wallace Annenberg Chair at USC. And so spotting all these issues that we've talked about in the media, from these faux debates to the overrepresentation of the Black middle class, to the media liking to perpetuate a sort of divide and rule politics. How do you now see your role in the media, and has your view of your role in the media, has that changed since you first entered?
Yeah, I think it has to change as you get older as well. And I think you can spend a lot of your time and energy identifying the problems, which is what I have done for a lot of my career. And I'm proud of how I've done it. I've put my work and my intellect and my integrity into identifying those problems as best I could. But I think there comes a point where you have to try and be part of the solution. And that's what that looks like is different for everyone. In my case, I've started my own company and now I create content, and I intend to create platforms for other people and opportunities for other people who want to change the media landscape and the way we tell our stories. And that's really important to me. And it's also important that it's not about me, and that I can now use the profile that I've built to bring up other people, a new generation of people, voices that we haven't heard, people who have always been excluded by the mainstream media in this country and internationally. And working in African countries is really important to me as well, because I try to practice what I preach, and I really believe that being disconnected from the African continent is never ever going to be a positive thing for Black people. And I also think that the global pattern of kind of regarding Africa as a place apart, when actually it's been integral to all creative innovation ever, is really wrong. So that's something that I do. I'm, as you said, teaching journalism in the US, and it's important to me to be part of feeling like I'm training a new generation, not just of journalists, but of editors and maybe media owners who have had a different conditioning and education when it comes to the way they see and frame these issues. So that's something that I find really fulfilling. And for me, it's just an approach of every day working out how I can change things and be part of the change, and use what I've learned and what I've done to see if we can make things different. And I think if I can be part of a critical mass of people feeling that way, then we might start to see things be different in future.
Well, I think that's an excellent place to end the interview. Although I just wanted to ask, is there something coming up that we should follow or something?
Not that I can talk about yet. Well, when's this going to go out? October? It's a bit difficult. There is, but I don't think I can talk about it yet. So maybe we'll have to reconvene in the future when I can.
Well, thank you so much, Afua, for joining us.
It was really nice to meet you. It's a great interview. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Seun Matiluko, and I'm the founder of the OLBA Network. To find out more about the OLBA Network, please check out our page on the faculty website.